taxes. For the next presentation, we'll have Eric Stafford from the Kansas Chamber of Commerce tell us about where we're going with taxes, maybe get to some of the questions that were just asked about what systems need to be in place and where we go moving forward after we just got the history. Thank you, Eric.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. As James mentioned, my name's Eric Stafford. Can you guys hear me okay? Can? Okay. I serve as Vice President of Government Affairs for the Kansas Chamber. We are a membership-based organization based in Topeka that our function is to advocate and lobby on behalf of the business community at the State House in Topeka. So we represent the private sector business community of the state. We've got large members that Spirits and Sprints and Garmin's, but we also, I'd say probably 75% of our membership are businesses with 50 or fewer employees. So we are made up of small organizations as well, so as the bulk of our membership. So Dave and James asked that we give a little bit of background on what's the budget process look like in Topeka, and what's tax policy look like, and some historical perspective, and to the question that was asked, what do we do going forward if the 2012 tax plan isn't the right option? So real quick, just in terms of the state general fund, Dave broke out a little bit of the background of the budget process and income taxes, excise taxes such as sales tax, fees. So banks or insurance premiums, they are taxed or assessed fees to fund their governing agencies, KDHE, on environmental type of fees, that type of tax. But the consensus revenue estimating process, that's essentially where the budget comes from and how it's set. The consensus revenue estimating group is made up of folks from Department of Revenue, from legislative research, and then some economists from regions, institutions across the state. And their job is to come present to the legislature. You work through the entire legislative process. Legislature starts the first Monday after the first Tuesday, basically the second week of January is when the legislature starts. They don't get the consensus revenue estimates for the next fiscal year until around April 20th. And then they take their break 1st of April, then they come back late April, 1st of May for veto session to come back and address largely budget, occasionally a veto here and there from the governor's office. But the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group puts together their estimates for the outlook of the state's budget picture in April. So they spend January through April putting together a $6 billion budget. So let's see how quickly we can throw together $6 billion in 90 days and try to get 63 votes in the House, 21 in the Senate, and get a budget passed. Agencies come in, talk about what they need, why they need it. Legislature approves it. You go through the amendment process, and they pass a budget. Then the revenue estimating group meets. They revise the budget when they come back in April and pass the mega budget there at the very end if there are significant modifications, whether it's cuts due to the recession or budget surpluses is what we're currently facing right now. And then the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group meets again in November to say, okay, we're halfway through the year. Let's look at the numbers, see where we're at. Under the Brownback administration, there were, I think they went 44 out of 48 months missing the mark on how much money the state was going to be bringing in. So the tax cuts went into effect in 2012, effective mostly in 2013. And then from that point on, we had 4 years essentially of the legislature trying to build estimates and the governor building budgets based off of numbers that continually failed to reach the mark, which is why you were reading budget problems in the state for months and years at a time. That got to be a significant problem. They modified internally some of the processes of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. Those processes have since, I think we're on 14 straight months now of exceeding budget estimates. So we fixed the problem. The downside was it took 4 years to do it. Just as more of a global picture of the budget, You'll see here individual income tax, sales tax make up the bulk of revenue for the budget. This is fiscal year 2018 data. This is from the governor's budget report. So this isn't a Kansas Chamber Excel file pie. This is from the state of Kansas. But then you also see the expenditures by function. So you'll see the big chunk of the pie being education. You got some public safety, human services, such as Medicaid, transportation, et cetera. So that kind of gives you a very quick outlook on the budget. Historical perspective of the budget. I put this up here, and I wish I realized this morning I should have put a different picture up there. I've got a picture that shows the graph from 2003 through 2015. But the interesting part to me that we've highlighted is what's the right size of government in Kansas? How much does Kansas need to operate? Nobody really has the answer to that question. They spend what they think they're getting, but is spending what you're getting enough? If I give my kids a $20 bill, you think they're going to save any of it? No, they're going to buy $20 worth of candy. But the same picture that I have here, it shows the expenditure. So in 2003, the SGF for the state of Kansas, State General Fund for Kansas, was $4.1 billion. In 2008, it was 6.1. So you have a $2 billion increase from 2003 to 2008. So remember the good economic times of the early 2000s. We were flush with cash. Spending all that money, we still had $500 million ending balances. $580 million of that increase in 2005 came from the Montoy decision. So take out $580 out of $2 billion, you're still left with $1.4 billion worth of spending increases for the state of Kansas. Meanwhile, as we'll talk about shortly, we continue to lose taxpayers, so we have a high tax burden, we continue to spend more, but we have fewer taxpayers holding the burden of supporting this level of state government and local government here in the state of Kansas. But this gives you an outlook of receipts and expenditures. I would point out that 2019 has been revised going into May when the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group met, and then the legislature revised the budget. That expenditures of $6.6 billion, you're now starting to get into the $7 billion threshold. We're crossing $7 billion in state spending for the first time in our state's history. So again, this is the revised estimates. You'll see down here the 2018-2019 revised receipts and where we're at with revenues for the state. Some interesting just data. This isn't going to show up well, but if you have a smartphone, see Gene Solentrop in the office. He still uses one of them old flip phones, so he doesn't have a smartphone. Just kidding. But if you search under the App Store, Tax Foundation Facts and Figures, Tax Foundation's a great resource, nonpartisan, just factual information on tax policy and data for all 50 states. Then they break down research articles and topics and put out a lot of good information. But some of the highlights that I want to point out from where Kansas ranks in terms of our high tax burden. Essentially, collectively, Kansas does a lot of things really well. We rank really high in some areas nationally, but none of that is in the area of tax policy. In 2010, there was a push by Governor Parkinson to increase sales tax by 1%. He was a Democrat when Sebelius left, and the Senate Democrat minority leader at the time, Anthony Hensley, said that a 1 cent sales tax increase is dead on arrival. 1 cent sales tax increase passed in 2010, so that shows you the power of the second floor. 4/10 of that was to go toward the new highway plan a couple years later. So then in 2015, sales tax was increased again to a state rate of 6.5%. That paired up with the local average of 2.18% puts us as the 8th highest sales tax burden in the country. As you get into other data, just worth noting, per capita collection of personal income taxes is middle of the pack. Our state tax collections per capita, where's Kansas? We're off the chart here. 22nd. We're 25th when you compare state and local, and then other rankings, cell phone taxes, et cetera. So they give a whole bunch of data. Property taxes, Dave's going to get into that later. One thing worth noting that one of the statistics included in the tax foundation here is state debt per capita. Collectively, the state of Kansas is in pretty good shape. We're 16th worst in the or 16th. We're 34th worst. We're 16th best in the nation in terms of state debt. But you throw in the state and local debt, and we jump to 15th worst. So our local government debt is excessive and out of control, and that is something that will eventually have to be changed. So as a business organization, we lobby obviously on tax policy, but anything that impacts the bottom line of businesses in the state of Kansas, whether it's unemployment insurance taxes, which we've seen significant reforms there, workers' compensation insurance, we've seen significant reforms there, healthcare, energy costs, legal climate, anything that impacts the bottom line of our membership, we lobby for or against policy at the State House in Topeka. Each year in December, we conduct a business leaders poll or CEO poll of 300 businesses across the state. They might be members, they might not be, and ask them a series of questions that are relative to issues impacting the state and policy matters that are big at the time, whether it's repealing the LLC exemption or immigration policy or health care. We'll ask a pretty extensive survey, but we've been doing this since 2004. Some of the questions have been the same since 2004, so we have a historical perspective to see what changes and dynamics the business community has. This question here is, we ask the same question, what's most important to the profitability of your company? First, we ask it as an open-ended question, and then we ask it with a list of choices where they can select two. So you'll see that taxes matter. Taxes are important to business. They'll remain important to business. Again, I will highlight and express with the utmost plead that you listen to Dave's talk about property taxes as we get into that later in this presentation. That is a huge burden to the business community as we're assessed at 2.5 times the rate almost as residential property statewide. So taxes continue to be a priority for the business community. Seeing the fluctuations of deregulations, mandates, or healthcare costs, and you'll see in 2016 that was the first time that healthcare costs exceeded the tax burden as a concern for the business community. So obviously rising premiums, 53% of Kansans get their insurance from their employer, and that's obviously a concern as we have found and predicted that the Affordable Care Act isn't the right approach in our view for lowering the cost of health care. So again, property taxes, the only reason I put this statistic up here is just to show when we ask folks, would you rather increase or decrease the sales tax, income taxes, property taxes, the sentiment of the property tax piece, and Dave will get into that with really good data here shortly. So ultimately, taxes do matter to businesses. The Brownback tax cuts were repealed. Dave did a good job of highlighting the kind of myths about what happened. You can't cut taxes and increase spending. The tax plan that passed ultimately wasn't the tax plan that was in conference committee that folks were working toward, but the Senate leadership at the time prevented that plan from going forward, and they passed a very expensive plan, and that's ultimately the only plan that was given to the governor, and they ran with it. But the governor did not address the spending side of state government. So, but taxes matter, as I said. Kansas, just this January, United Van Lines, they come out with an annual report to see who's leaving what states, and Kansas was 5th in the country in terms of the outmigration of taxpayers. So we used to have, I don't know, some of you in the room might remember when Kansas had 6 congressional districts. Back in the 70s, they were down to 5. Now we're down to 4, potentially down to 3 as the census gets done in 2020 and they do redistricting in 2022. We might be holding flat enough that we can keep 4 districts, but we might have to go down to 3 for the U.S. House. But we're behind the outmigration of states like Illinois, New York, Connecticut, Very high tax states. Connecticut's raised their taxes twice on the rich to try and balance their budget in terms of several $100 million budget deficits, and they continue to lose people from the state of Connecticut. And finally, their Democratic governor said, we get it, raising taxes on the rich doesn't help. We have to find a way to be more competitive. So taxes matter, money walks, and people that have the ability to choose to where they want to relocate will choose states and locations that are lower tax burden compared to others. Again, without rehashing too much of the 2012 tax cuts, the small business portion took the headlines. That was the unfairness issue, and that's what caused the state budget. A lot of folks ran on repealing the LLC loophole because that wrecked the state budget, even though that was only about 20%, 25% of the total fiscal cost to the state. The other 75% went to individual taxpayers. All of us sitting in here in the room, unless any of you are business owners and members of ours, thank you for your support. But every day, individual taxpayers receive the bulk of the tax cuts through the reduction in personal income tax rates. So again, just highlighting, looking at the tax cuts, the receipts, you go 2012, 2013, 2014, you see the drop of revenue, 6.3 billion to 5.6 billion, but that was sustainable because of this number here. We had a $709 million budget surplus. Governor Brown, back when he took office, had it was like literally like $1,000 in the state's bank. I mean, it was, if that, it might have been $200. I can't remember the number, but he did a good job of saving to make sure that we had ending balances. The legislature is required every year to have a 7.5% ending balances, except they add a few words and that it gives them an exemption for that year, and they're able to get around it. So we never really have a 7.5% ending balance. We built up a $700 million ending balance, and then a 379, and then you see 71, 37, and that's because spending increased, and then the tax cuts were going into effect, and it wasn't sustainable. So that led to the tax increase in 15, and then the ultimate repeal in 17 after the negative headlines for multiple years had a shift in direction for the legislature. So real quick, looking on the 2017 tax increase, the small business tax cuts were entirely repealed. Everything, including tax increases on the individuals, were retroactive to January 1 of 2017, even though the bill passed in June. It was estimated to be about $600 million annually. The receipts are coming in now, and you're looking at it's actually about a $750 million per year tax increase on the state of Kansas, in addition to the $430 million annual tax increase that passed in 2015. Which leads us into the 2018 tax reforms. Before I get into all that, I want to go back to the gentleman's question about what do we do going forward. I mentioned the tax foundation earlier, and believe it or not, I don't know if we're going to use them or not. We might use Ernst & Young or somebody else like that. We have some reluctance to use the tax foundation, but ultimately they're a good group. I don't know if we'll utilize them or not, but they've done some nice glossy books for South Carolina and Nebraska and Iowa and Illinois, North Carolina, before North Carolina implemented the second phase of tax cuts that they ended up going with. But what we've talked to them about is, okay, so the 2012 tax cuts, that's not the way to go for the state of Kansas. What is? You look at states like North Carolina and Indiana that Dave mentioned, and North Carolina has jumped from, they were ranked below us in terms of the overall economic competitiveness of their state, in the low 40s to their top 10 now, based on the tax changes that they've made in their state. And their tax changes and rate reductions have all taken place through reductions through growth in government. So as state receipts exceed a certain level, then that's when you'll see the reduction in rates. So it allows for responsible growth. Oregon, believe it or not a red state like Kansas, not sure if you're aware of that, Oregon, very, very blue. In their state constitution, they have that they are allowed 2% growth in state receipts. If they exceed 2% growth, a credit is automatically returned to the taxpayers. So they have a credit on the following year's tax return to spend down the excess revenue that the state receives. So if Oregon can do it and expand Medicaid and do whatever that they do, then surely Kansas can handle responsible growth in government as well. But what we've asked the Tax Foundation to do, and we're waiting on our quote to see how much of a ding to our pocket it's going to be, but is, let's put together a fancy booklet of where Kansas tax policy is deficient on all fronts: sales tax, income taxes, and property taxes. Part of that will be potentially eliminating some sales tax exemptions that exist today. So Kansas has a vast amount of sales tax exemptions, and this year had this 2018 federal reform I'm about to get to. Folks talk about broadening the base. This bill would have, as passed by the Senate, we were only advocating on the federal portion, but as the legislative process works, they take everything ugly, they throw it all together to try and buy votes, and then they pass it. And so this had new sales tax exemptions for certain organizations, nonprofit hospices, for example. There are certain instead of giving the entire hospice community a sales tax exemption, this one just gave one hospice a sales tax exemption. So again, disequal treatment in terms of tax policy for the legislature historically has picked winners and losers. Now, as they look to broaden the base, our perspective and our concern is we need to make sure that we're not taxing business-to-business inputs. If we eliminate sales tax exemptions for, thinking off the top of my head, rental of construction equipment or whatever it might be, we want to make sure that the business-to-business exemptions would exist, and that's the recommendation from the Tax Foundation. So they'll look at all those. And we would like to present that to the legislature. It won't be done. We were hoping to have it done by January 2019. They're currently working on projects for 3 other states, so we're probably looking 2020 in terms of a global tax picture. And quite frankly, I think right now, just kind of reading tea leaves, I think there's just a little tax hangover. There's a big tax hangover. We had a lot of fights over taxes over the last few years, and I think also, too, from our organization's perspective, we want to be thorough and come together with a good plan on what Kansas can do to improve our competitiveness. So real quick on the 2018 federal reform. So this was a big push this year by our organization. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in December of 2017, passed by Congress, signed by President Trump, and was a big win in terms of corporate tax cuts, individual tax cuts, small business tax cuts. Overall, a good piece of policy from the federal perspective as we deal with global competition and global income. Where Kansas comes in is we are one of the states, and I think there's 18 or 20 or so that are known as a rolling conformity state. So whatever provisions are adopted by the federal government, Kansas adopts. And included in that is repatriation. So I just saw an article today on Twitter as I was sitting here in the parking lot killing time that said American companies have repatriated $300 billion so far back to the United States. So U.S. companies that have earned foreign income and have kept that income overseas for the last 30 years because of disadvantageous tax laws are now starting to bring that back because of changes through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Kansas has never taxed foreign income. If we don't exempt ourselves, we will tax foreign income, which will be a significant hit to the business community, but, some will see it as a benefit to the state. Some being those who want more tax dollars. There's also a new provision called GILTI, which stands for Global Intangible Low Tax Income. That's a new pay for at the federal level to help reduce the corporate income tax rate at the federal level. That is new foreign income taxation, a new code of the IRS, new IRS code that Kansas will adopt unless we proactively exempt ourselves from it. There's a new pay for at the federal level on FDIC premiums that banks pay. So Kansas banks will now have to pay a tax on their FDIC premiums because the legislature failed to pass a bill that opted out from that provision. There's multiple other provisions that impacts businesses. On the individual side, the biggest change at the federal level was the fact that the standard deduction increased to $24,000. It doubled for married joint filers. Kansas's standard deduction is only $7,500. So our law says that if you don't, as a taxpayer, itemize at the federal level, you cannot itemize at the state level. So this is going to be a de facto tax increase because 97% of Kansans will not exceed that $24,000 standard deduction when they could exceed the $12,000 deduction, and therefore you are now exposing yourself at the state level to a higher state income tax liability because of the inability to itemize. So we had a proposal this year. It was all in our bill. Our attempt was just to address these federal changes, and then conference committee process throws it all together, puts it in a blender, and then says drink it. And we had 21 legislators on the Senate side say yes, and then we ultimately failed on the last day in the House on a 59 to 59 tie. Had 4 legislators gone that would have been with us that day for multiple reasons, but we failed to get that passed. So Kansans will see a tax increase. Our hope as an organization is that we come back next year to advocate for this same proposal, minus all the sales tax exemptions and stuff, but try to get that done ASAP and make it effective January 1, 2018, so we can avoid a retroactive tax increase, or avoid a tax increase on Kansans, because our tax burden's high. I think that's largely driven by the fact that we have a lot of government for a relatively conservative state. We like our counties, we like our townships, we like our fire districts, we like our library districts, airport authorities, anything that can breathe and eat and walk, we're going to tax the hell out of it and try to make it work. So we are 3rd highest in the nation, I believe, 4th highest in the nation in terms of the number of public employees per capita. There's some effort. I think if we could look at a way to incentivize consolidation of services, both at the local level. Don't force it upon them, but find some sweet stick that will make them all want to do it, then by all means we'll save more money in the long run. So that's our perspective. I think that's my last slide. And let me see if I left anything out here that I need to address. I think that covers the gist of it. Essentially, the message that we want to give today is taxes matter to our members, and we want to find ways that government can be delivered more efficiently. Dave's testified numerous times before the legislature, and one message that he gives that makes a lot of sense is every state's providing the exact same service to their people. There are states that just do it a lot cheaper than others, and we're unfortunately not one of those cheaper states. We're kind of an expensive state to operate. So let's work to try to find ways to do this more efficiently and still provide same effective services that benefit the citizens of our state. And let's actually change the out-migration to become an in-migration state. We are a great state. Let's start focusing on the positive and work to grow this state together. So thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I want to know who named the tax provision at the federal level guilty.
Yeah, attorneys.
One thing I didn't say before, when you're getting ready to ask a question, if you could say who you are, if you're running for the legislature, if you're currently in the legislature, that would be very helpful to all the folks in the audience to better understand who's here, where the questions are coming from.
And if they are in the legislature, don't throw anything at them. Just kidding.
Everybody, yes.
Al David, I'm just a taxpayer. You mentioned that Kansas does basically a poor job of managing local debt. Do you happen to know off the top of your mind how Wichita or Stafford County stacks up among its peers?
No, I just have the collective data from the tax foundation. Surely we could find a way to break it down on a local basis. Wichita has been historically one of the more efficiently operated governments, relatively speaking, but I don't have that data.
Don't be coy when you raise your hand, by the way. Raise it high, be proud.
Paul Wagner from Hutchinson, Burlington, Westport. Question about the tax policy to adjust the Kansas rates that failed on the 59-59 vote. I'd heard it kind of slander that this is some big giveaway to giant corporations or something. What's the real scoop on that?
No, and that was argument being made. It was really interesting being heavily involved in that push. I mean, we had 9 days to work to pass a pretty significant piece of legislation. And, you know, the final day, once it gets through the Senate, then you start seeing emails from schools go out against the changes. Why schools would advocate, I mean, they want the money, but it's essentially, it deals with federal tax changes that are ultimately going to have an impact on Kansas state taxpayers. But there was nothing in there that was a giveaway to corporations. We weren't lowering the state rates. This all had to deal with provisions that are new to the federal tax code that Kansas will automatically adopt, that will tax income that we have never taxed before. We tax foreign dividend income, but we do not tax foreign income. And there's a difference, and it's treated separately, it's treated differently, but these changes were entirely to decouple from 5 key federal provisions: FDIC premiums, interest expense limitations, capital contributions, repatriation, and GILTI. Those are the provisions that we were asking the state to decouple from and not tax going forward for businesses in our state. So as of now, every state that has taken this on has decoupled from repatriation and GILTI income. Kansas is the only one to not do it right now.
John Whitmer, I represent the 93rd district, so, and you can throw anything you want. Because we didn't do what we needed to do, so I'll take some blame on that. I wanted to add one thing on your slide, number 28. We have the second highest sales tax on food in the country. So you can add that to your little list of lovely points of pride. Along those lines, we now have the ability, thanks to the United States Supreme Court, to raise the internet sales tax. And I know you and I have had many long debates on that particular topic. I just want to make sure that when we go back up there, I know our tax chair, if he is the tax chair, wants to run that again. My understanding is the chamber's position is going to be, we're all in on that as long as it's revenue neutral. So we could do something like take the revenue and lower a sales tax on food. I just want to see if your thought would be along those same lines.
2 seconds on background for those people who aren't familiar. Eric, if you could address what the Supreme Court ruling was and then answer.
Okay, so historically there's a case called Quill. It's known as the Quill decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that said that states can't, this had to deal with catalogs. Do you remember buying from catalogs back? I remember flipping through catalogs when I was a kid. I never bought anything because my parents didn't give me their credit card number, but if they did, I would have bought a lot. So the advancement in technology and e-commerce has led states to try and come up on their own effort to address taxation of internet products. So essentially, South Dakota passed a law a few years ago that they passed with the intention to have challenged, and theirs was an administrative law. Clearly, no penalties. It cannot be applied retroactively. And there's a threshold to qualify on whether you have to submit and remit sales tax as a business, online only with no presence in the state of South Dakota, if you have to submit sales tax to their state. So the Supreme Court just ruled, what was that, last week or 2 weeks ago? They've been popping out a lot of big decisions over the last week, like a birthing center of legal decisions. They just came out with the South Dakota Wayfair decision and ruled in favor of South Dakota. They said there are clear protections in there for businesses, clear protections for the state. It doesn't violate the Interstate Commerce Clause, et cetera. So, yes, to Representative Whitmer's point, we do support taxing online sales for leveling the playing field between online only and your brick and mortar stores, Best Buy, mom and pop in Heston, Kansas, who has a retail presence on Main Street. So we have had that in our legislative agenda since 2013 at the request of our membership. Now, going forward into next year, what's going to happen? I think this opinion, and I still have bookmarked a Tax Foundation article to read. I want to read through the decision and synopsis, and just got another email today from the Council of State Taxation breaking that down. what does that mean for the state? So the bill that was before the legislature last year for consideration that cleared tax committee that ultimately did not run on the House floor, I think went above and beyond what South Dakota did. That bill had, Kansas already has a law in the books, real quick. There's about 20 states that have what's called click-through nexus. If you have click-through nexus, it's called New York style click-through nexus. We got that passed in 2013 for sales over, I think it's $10,000, then you have to remit sales tax to the state. So there are three or four different types of pieces of legislation that states have moved forward with. I think that South Dakota Wayfair decision is written tightly enough that South Dakota could potentially become the model, so to speak. What I want to see is what happens to the streamlined sales tax agreement that Kansas is a participating state in. Is there a uniform approach, or is that decision written narrowly enough to where Congress will be forced by the business community to act to come up with a clear and concise way to treat taxation of internet purchases? So I think there's still a lot of question marks, but I also think that going forward, and if you read our testimony, I think it was 2579, I think was the bill number from last year, or 2759, whatever it was, we put in our testimony, just proceed cautiously, and I also included the South Dakota bill because the Kansas bill last year was very complex and convoluted, and the South Dakota's is very clean. And I attached a copy of the South Dakota language to our testimony just to say, FYI, this version of Kansas, what you guys are considering, is different than what South Dakota has passed and what's before the Supreme Court. So, yeah, I think there's still uncertainty, but I also think, to your point, John, I think there'll be some protections in place based on the way the Supreme Court ruled that states will be still pretty limited on how they apply taxation to internet sales. So,
Thank you, Eric.
yeah. Is that it? Thank you.